read the textbook and go through the textbooks to look at what happens in chapter 20. So these are the same things we talked about before, so we're going to just move right along. All right, so what makes this kind of unique? We're just going to start right here. P and Y. Usually, when we talk about prices, we talk about the real price. However, in this model, it is going to be the nominal price. So we are not going to make adjustments to make it the real price. It is actually going to be the nominal price. So you should think about this nominal price as being, say, the CPI, the GDP deflator. Things that we talked about in chapter 10 and 11, we talked about price indexes. So think about this P as being either the CPI or the GDP deflator. Now, Y here. Y is always what Y is. Y is always real GDP with the real income from a country. So when we think about this, Y is what it always is, and P is going to be the price level. We're going to have a curve that looks just like demand. In fact, we're going to call it demand. Except what we're going to call it here is aggregate demand. What does the term aggregate mean? Aggregate means all the demands in the country added together. So hence the term aggregate. We're going to have two supply curves. We're going to have what we call a short-run aggregate supply curve, and it's going to be upward sloping, just like always. A supply we've always seen kind of as an upward sloping line, and this one's going to be the same. And just like always, we're going to have a price, an equilibrium price, and we're going to have an equilibrium quantity. So if we look at it in the short run, life looks just like the graph we always have done. Aggregate supply is an upward sloping line. Demand is a downward sloping line. We're just going to talk in this chapter a lot about these other little parts. What makes it short run aggregate, or demand, what makes it an aggregate demand. So that's what we're going to focus a lot about on this chapter. What makes these curves move? Why are they what they are? But you should still relate back to chapter 4 and still see a supply and a demand. We're just going to talk about why these supplies and demands are a little different. So as always, even though we call it supply and demand, we always focus on demand first. I don't know why, but every book I've ever done always talks about demand first. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about the demand curve first, and then we're going to talk about the supply curves. So as I said before, the aggregate demand curve shows all quantity of goods and services demanded in the economy at any given price level. So remember, this is CPI, and this is real GDP. So when you think about aggregate demand, so think about back in chapter 10 when we talked about GDP. Well, where does GDP come from? Well, GDP, remember, is all the goods and services that are bought by households. Kind of the goods and services bought by businesses, goods and services bought by government, and goods and services bought by foreigners. So when we think about aggregate demand, we should go back to our equation. C plus I plus G plus NX. That's what's going to determine aggregate demand. So when you write down aggregate demand, the first thing that should come to your mind is, oh, that's simply consumption plus government spending plus net exports. So when you're thinking about that, you're thinking about these four variables. So why does aggregate demand slope downward? Well, let's talk about this. So what does P influence? Well, P doesn't influence G, because government spends money on what government wants to spend money on. It doesn't go, ooh, things are on sale, I think I'll buy more. Ooh, things became more expensive, I think I'll buy less. No, the government says I'm going to spend this and I'm going to buy 10 tanks. Price? Whatever, I'm buying 10 tanks. That's what we want. So government policy is not necessarily based on the prices. So when prices change, it doesn't affect G. Government officials don't think about prices. Listen to any debate you hear about, listen to any debate in Congress. How many times do they debate? Well, prices went down. I think we should allocate more money there. That is not how they work. So prices doesn't affect G. So when we talk about why it's downward sloping, we're only going to talk about the variables that are affected by P. That's C, I, and NX. So the first one we're going to talk about is C. And the consumption part is going to be influenced by what we call the wealth effect. So what we're going to do is I'm going to focus on a declining P. So for this discussion, we're always going to talk about P going down. I could make the same story with P going up. The arrows just change. So if the price levels decrease, okay, consumers feel wealthier. Well, why do I feel wealthier? Well, if prices go down, it feels like my dollars can go further because the money in my pocket feels like I have more of it. So I feel wealthier. And what happens when I feel wealthier? Consumption increases. So I move downward along AD. So the story with the wealth effect, prices decrease, I feel wealthier. It feels like my money will go farther. And because I feel wealthier, I increase my consumption. When I increase my consumption, we move downward along the aggregate demand curve. That's effect one. That's P and C. Effect two, the more important effect, or the most important effect in describing aggregate demand. Right? Because remember, I makes a big impact on Y. Because remember, I changes a lot, changes GDP a lot. So we're going to have the same thing here. We're going to have the interest rate effect. So P and I. So just like before, P decreases. Just like before, people feel wealthier. Because the real value of dollars has increased. So I don't need as much money as I needed before, right? So I need fewer dollars. But what do I do with these extra dollars? Well, not only do I buy more goods and services, but I also can save more. So now go back to chapter 13. Right? Remember the market for loanable funds. What happens when we increase savings? Well, if you go back to chapter 13, we see the interest rate decreases. When the interest rates decrease, we know investment increases. And when investment increases, we move down along the AD curve. So price level falls. I feel wealthier. When I feel wealthier, I save more. By saving more causes interest rates to fall. Interest rates falling causes investments to increase. And when this investment increases, we move down along the aggregate demand curve. Like always, prices doesn't shift curves. It just moves us along the curve. So here we can see where chapter 13 kind of plays a role in understanding the interest rate effect. And then finally, the last one, the exchange rate effect. How does the exchange rate effect work? Well, first thing we know is, well, exchange rate is probably going to affect net exports. So we kind of hint at what variables you should be looking at. So if I say the exchange rate, we're going, okay, that's net exports. So how does the story work? As always, we're going to start prices go down. Right, so from prices go down from the interest rate effect, right? I know interest rates fall. Right, when interest rates fall, if we go back and look at chapter 19, we can see exchange rates fall. And when exchange rates fall, or exchange rates cause a dollar to depreciate, we know net exports increase. And when net exports increase, aggregate demand, we move down along the aggregate demand. So the exchange rate effect works as prices fall. Well, we know from the interest rate effect that interest rates fall. So when prices fall, interest rates fall. When interest rates fall, exchange rates fall, causing net exports to increase, which causes us to move down along the curve. We have this aggregate demand curve, and now as prices fall, we move down the curve. So we should expect Y to increase. So here's the opposite. So with an increase in prices, right, we move upward on the curve, right? So, and why is that? Well, because of all three effects: the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect. So here's kind of the little pictures of it. There's the C, there's the I, there's the NX. So it kind of gives you graphically what is happening. All right, that's kind of an ending point for today. It kind of ends at a proper point. On Wednesday, we're going to talk about what causes aggregate demand to shift. We're also going to go through the supply parts. What is short-run aggregate supply? What is long-run aggregate supply? How do those curves move? Why are they drawn how they're drawn? And then finally, we're going to put the economy together. And we're going to talk about short-run equilibrium, long-run equilibrium, and stagflation. All right, are there any questions then about today's discussion?